Get your ghetto ass away from my surgical wing before I break something you can't stitch back together. The words hit Dr. Imara Okonkwo like shrapnel as Garrett Slade's thick palm cracked against her chest, shoving her backward into the cold hospital wall. Her shoulder blade connected with concrete, sending a sharp bolt of pain down her spine. The security chief stepped closer, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of cheap aftershave and arrogance flooding a space. Housekeeping entrances around back, sweetheart. He jabbed a finger toward the service corridor. Learn your place. Imara didn't stumble, didn't flinch, just absorbed the impact in absolute stillness, her dark eyes fixed on the man who had no idea he'd just put his hands on the woman whose grandfather's name was carved in the building's cornerstone. The same woman who in exactly 3 hours would be standing over his only son's dying body, holding the scalpel that could save him or let him slip away forever. Before we continue, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you absolutely cannot miss. The morning had started with such promise. Dawn light spilled across the skyline of Hartwell City as Imara's town car pulled up to Sterling Okonkwo Memorial Hospital. She hadn't seen this building in 5 years, not since she left for Geneva to lead the International Trauma Institute. But some things you never forget. The way the morning sun caught the bronze letters of her family name, the slight chip in the third step where she'd tripped as a medical student, the ancient oak tree her grandfather had planted the day the hospital opened in 1962. She'd returned to reclaim what was hers, to restore what had been corrupted, to honor a legacy that stretched back generations. She'd chosen to arrive early, 3 days before her official return as chief of surgery. No fanfare, no announcement. Just Imara in jeans and a simple cream blouse, her medical credentials tucked in a purse rather than hanging around her neck. She wanted to see her hospital the way patients saw it, the way her grandfather had always insisted she should. You can't lead what you don't understand, baby girl, Solomon Okonkwo used to say, his weathered hands steady as he taught her to suture on orange peels in his study. And you can't understand a place until you've walked through it invisible. So invisible she would be, at least for a few hours. The lobby looked different than she remembered, smaller somehow. The grand portrait of her grandfather that had hung behind the reception desk for 60 years had been moved to a dim corner near the restrooms. The frame was dusty. The lighting above it had burned out and never been replaced. In its place hung a generic landscape painting, the kind you'd find in any budget hotel. The diversity awards her father had worked so hard to earn were gone from their display cases, replaced by corporate mission statements printed in sterile fonts. Imara's chest tightened, but she kept walking, her sneakers silent on the polished floor. The emergency room waiting area told a clearer story. She settled into a plastic chair near the vending machines, pretending to scroll through a phone while her eyes cataloged everything. A white family of 4 was called back within 10 minutes of arrival, the father joking with the nurse about weekend golf games. A black mother with a feverish toddler had been waiting for an hour, her worried eyes constantly checking the triage desk, her daughter whimpering softly against her shoulder. An elderly Latino man clutched his chest, grimacing, while the intake nurse chatted casually with a colleague about weekend plans. "Excuse me?" The black mother finally approached the desk, her voice tight with controlled desperation. "My daughter's fever is getting higher. She's been vomiting for hours. Is there any way someone could see her soon?" "Ma'am, you'll be called when it's your turn." The nurse didn't look up from her computer. "Have a seat." "But she's burning up. Please, if someone could just check her temperature." "Ma'am." Now the nurse looked up, her expression hardening into something cold and dismissive. "I said have a seat. We'll get to you when we get to you." Imara watched the mother retreat, watched her hold a sick child closer. That familiar helplessness, that forced silence. Imara knew it intimately, had felt it herself in spaces where her credentials meant nothing because her skin spoke first. She made her way toward the surgical wing, her anger building with each step. Through the glass windows of a conference room, she spotted a young black woman in scrubs being dressed down by a red-faced white attending. The young woman, her name tag read Dr. Kessie Ajie, stood with perfect posture, while the attending's finger jabbed the air inches from her face. "I don't care what they taught you at whatever affirmative action program handed you that degree. In my OR, you do exactly what I say when I say it. You don't think, you don't question. You follow orders like a good little resident. Understood? Yes, sir, Dr. Harmon. Kessie's voice was steady, but Imara caught the slight tremble in her hands, the controlled breathing of someone who had learned to survive by swallowing fire. Imara recognized that survival, had lived in herself for decades, had thought foolishly, perhaps, that her hospital would be different. Near the nursing station, she noticed an older black woman in scrubs organizing medication carts. Even from a distance, Imara recognized her. Bettina Rawls, who had worked with her grandfather since the hospital's earliest days. Bettina had been there when Imara took her first steps in this very hallway, had bandaged her scraped knees when she fell off her bicycle in the parking lot. Bettina looked older now, her movements slower, the spark in her eyes dimmer than Imara remembered. When a young white orderly brushed past her without acknowledgement, nearly knocking the cart from her hands, Bettina simply steadied herself and continued working. No complaint, no confrontation, just quiet endurance worn into the grooves of her face. That's when Imara decided she'd seen enough of the public spaces. She needed to see the surgical wing, the heart of the hospital, the place where her grandfather had performed over 10,000 operations. She needed to see what had become of his legacy. The corridor leading to the restricted surgical area was painted the same pale green it had always been, but the feeling was different, colder somehow. She was 3 steps from the double doors when a thick arm shot out, blocking her path. "Where do you think you're going?" Garrett Slade stood like a wall of cheap authority, mid-50s, buzz cut going gray, a neck that merged directly into his shoulders. His security uniform was pressed sharp, his badge polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him screamed former military, current bully. But there was something else there too, something wounded behind the aggression. The permanent scowl of a man who had expected more from life and blamed everyone else for not getting it. She would learn later that he'd been passed over for police chief in his hometown 3 times, that his wife had left him for his former best friend, that he'd moved to Hartwell City 5 years ago to start over and found himself guarding doors instead of kicking them down. None of that excused what he was about to do, but it explained the bitterness that radiated from him like heat from asphalt. "I'm heading to the surgical wing. I'd like to observe the facilities." Garrett's eyes traveled down her body, then back up, his lip curling slightly. "Surgical wing is restricted access, staff and patients only. I understand. I have credentials that I don't care what you have." He stepped closer, using his bulk to crowd her space. "You're not dressed like staff. You're not on my list, and you're definitely not a patient in this wing." His eyes flicked to her casual clothes, her natural hair, her brown skin. "Housekeeping entrances around back, service elevator too. That's where your people go." Your people. The words hung in the air like smoke from a burning cross. "I'm not housekeeping," Imara said, her voice still measured. "My name is—" "I don't need your name." Garrett cut her off with a harsh laugh. "I need you to turn around and take yourself back to whatever section of this hospital you actually belong in, and it ain't this one." A white doctor walked past them, nodding briefly to Garrett before pushing through the restricted doors without showing any identification. Garrett nodded back, almost friendly. "Good morning, Dr. Patterson." The door swung closed, leaving Imara standing in the hallway like an intruder in her own inheritance. "I'd like to speak with the chief of surgery," Imara tried again. "Chief doesn't deal with complaints from your type. Now I'm going to say this one more time. Turn around, walk away." "And if I don't?" Something ugly flickered across Garrett's face, something primal and hateful. "Then we have a problem." "I'm simply asking to." That's when his hand shot out, the heel of his palm connected with her chest, driving her backward into the wall. Her shoulder blade cracked against concrete, pain radiating down her arm like electricity. Before she could recover, he was in her face, close enough that she could see the broken capillaries in his nose, smell the coffee and hatred on his breath. "Get your ghetto ass away from my surgical wing before I break something you can't stitch back together." Spittle landed on her cheek. "Housekeeping entrances around back, sweetheart. Learn your place." Imara's hands remained at her sides. Her breathing stayed even.
Decades of navigating moments exactly like this one had taught her the cost of reaction, the power of stillness. She memorized his badge number, the exact time on the wall clock, the positioning of the security camera in the corner that had captured everything. "Are you finished?" she asked quietly. The question seemed to confuse him. People he shoved usually cowered or cried or cursed. They didn't stand there asking if he was finished like he was a child having a tantrum. "Get out." His voice dropped to a growl. "Before I have you arrested for trespassing." Imara straightened her blouse, brushed off her shoulder where the wall had left a dusty mark, and turned to walk away. Not in defeat, in calculation. Behind her, she heard Garrett mutter something to a passing orderly about these people thinking they own the place. If only he knew.
Imara walked through the corridors of her grandfather's hospital, her mind cataloging every change, every degradation, every sign of the rot that had set in during her absence. The walls that used to display photographs of groundbreaking surgeries and grateful patients now held generic corporate art. The plaque signer and staff members who had gone above and beyond had been replaced by mission statements that said everything and meant nothing. She passed the pediatric wing and paused at the window. Inside, a young black nurse was reading to a group of children, her voice animated, her smile genuine. At least some things hadn't changed. Some people still remembered what this place was supposed to be about. A memory surfaced unbidden. She was 7 years old, sitting in this very wing, recovering from a tonsillectomy. Her grandfather had come to check on her, still wearing his surgical scrubs, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. But he stayed for an hour, telling the stories about the patients he'd helped that day, about the lives he'd saved, about the difference one person could make if they refused to give up. "Every life matters, baby girl," he had told her, tucking the blanket around the small frame. "Every single one, rich or poor, kind or cruel. On my operating table, there's no difference. There's just a person who needs help and me with the skills to provide it." She had carried those words with her through medical school, through residency, through every challenging surgery and every impossible choice. They were the foundation of everything she had built. And now, standing in the hospital that bore his name, she wondered if that foundation had cracked while she wasn't watching. The administrative wing was quieter, tucked away from the chaos of patient care. Imara found an empty conference room and locked the door behind her. Her hands were steady as she pulled out a laptop, but inside a cold fire was building. She logged into the hospital's personnel system using credentials that had never been revoked. Her access level still read executive full clearance. 5 years away, and nobody had thought to change it. Perhaps they had hoped she would never return. Garrett Slade's file opened on the screen, hired 3 years ago by Vernon Marsh, the deputy administrator who'd been running the hospital in her absence. Prior employment, private security firms, 2 county jails with documented abuse complaints, a stint with a company that provided guards for immigration detention centers. Her performance reviews were glowing, maintains order with firm hand, excellent at handling difficult situations. Staff and patients respect his authority. Respect, that was an interesting word choice. Imara clicked deeper into the system, complaint records. Her stomach turned as she scrolled through page after page of documented grievances. 17 formal complaints against Garrett Slade in 3 years, 12 from black employees, 3 from Latino staff, 2 from Asian nurses. Allegations of racial slurs whispered in hallways, physical intimidation in break rooms. 1 accusation of assault that had been quietly settled out of court. Every single complaint marked resolved, no action required. She pulled up the broader HR records. Black doctors passed over for promotions despite superior qualifications. Black nurses assigned to night shifts at triple the rate of white nurses. Diversity training programs postponed indefinitely 3 years running. A pay equity analysis that showed black staff earning an average of 23% less than white counterparts in identical positions. And then she found the financial records. Vernon Marsh had been very busy. Supply contracts awarded to companies owned by his relatives at prices 40% above market rate, consulting fees paid to firms that existed only on paper, a renovation project that cost twice the quoted amount, with the overage disappearing in the untraceable accounts. Her grandfather had built this hospital with his own hands. He had performed surgery through death threats and bomb scares. He saved the lives of people who called him the worst names imaginable, because that was what healers did. And this is what they had turned his legacy into. 3 generations of Okonkwo surgeons had walked these halls. Her grandfather Solomon, who built the hospital from nothing, her father Marcus, who expanded it into a regional medical center, and now Imara, who had returned to find it hollowed out from within, its principles discarded, its mission corrupted. She thought about her father, who had died of a heart attack 5 years ago, the same week she had accepted the position in Geneva. He was worried about the hospital even then, had mentioned concerns about the new deputy administrator Vernon Marsh had, about changes in the culture that felt wrong. But Imara had been grieving, had been running, had told herself that the hospital would be fine, that the systems her family had built would hold. They hadn't hold. They had crumbled the moment no one was watching. Imara picked up a phone and dialed her attorney. "Celeste, I need you at the hospital. Bring the forensic team." She paused, looking at the data on the screen. "And you might want to give our contact at the FBI a heads up. We're going to have a lot to discuss." The first siren shattered the silence at 11:47 a.m.
Imara looked up from her laptop as the emergency broadcast system crackled to life throughout the hospital. "Code Orange, mass casualty event. All available personnel report to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Code Orange." Through the window, she could see ambulances streaming into the emergency bay. Staff ran past the conference room door. Something major had happened. She stepped into the hallway, following the flow of personnel toward the ER. A young nurse rushed past her, nearly colliding with her. "What happened?" Imara asked. "Highway pileup. 18-wheeler jackknifed on the interstate. Multiple vehicles. They're saying at least 15 casualties, maybe more." The nurse didn't wait for a response, disappearing around the corner at a run. Imara stood still for a moment, processing. Mass casualty events were rare, but devastating, overwhelming even the best prepared hospitals with the sheer volume of trauma. Every available surgeon would be needed. Every operating room would be in use. It would be hours of controlled chaos, of life and death decisions made in seconds. And here she was, still in her casual clothes, without a badge, without official standing, without anyone knowing she was even in the building. But she was also a trauma surgeon, one of the best in the world according to some, and there were people dying in the emergency room while she stood in the hallway contemplating her complicated feelings about institutional racism. The complicated feelings could wait, the dying could not. Imara made her way to the emergency room, staying on the periphery, watching as the organized chaos of trauma response unfolded. Gurneys crashed through doors, doctors shouted orders, the smell of blood and antiseptic filled the air. She spotted Bettina Rawls moving through the mayhem with practiced efficiency. Their eyes met across the room and Bettina's widened with recognition. "Dr. Okonkwo?" Bettina's voice cracked. "Is that really you?" "Bettina," Imara moved closer, lowering her voice. "Not now. We'll talk later. Right now, tell me what you're seeing." Bettina nodded, slipping back into professional mode. "Most are stable. Broken bones, lacerations, concussions. But there's one." She hesitated. "Trauma Bay 3, teenage boy. His injuries are catastrophic. Dr. Mareed is in there now, but he's saying the kid needs a specialist." "What kind of specialist?" "The kind we don't have." Bettina's voice dropped even lower. "Traumatic aortic dissection with splenic rupture. He needs someone who can do a simultaneous thoraco-abdominal repair. Dr. Mareed says there's only a handful of surgeons in the country who can even attempt it." Imara's heart rate remained steady, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Show me." She followed Bettina through the chaos to Trauma Bay 3. Through the glass, she could see a young man on the table, his chest covered with monitors, tubes running from every available surface. Dr. Yosef Mareed was a slight Ethiopian man with graying temples, studying scans on a wall-mounted display. "The aortic tear is here," Mareed was saying to his team, pointing to the scan, "and the splenic damage is catastrophic. If we try to repair one, he'll bleed out from the other. I've only seen this procedure done once at a conference in Geneva. The surgeon who did it was Dr. Imara Okonkwo." "Dr. Imara Okonkwo," Bettina said from the doorway, "and she's standing right behind me." The room went silent. Dr. Mareed turned slowly, his eyes widening as they found Imara. "Dr. Okonkwo," his voice was barely above a whisper, "I saw your presentation in Geneva, the Okonkwo technique. You pioneered the simultaneous repair methodology." "Show me his scans," Imara said simply. She stepped into the trauma bay, her eyes immediately going to the monitors. Heart rate erratic, blood pressure dropping. The young man's face was pale, almost gray, his body fighting a losing battle against catastrophic internal damage. "How long has he been like this?" Imara asked. 43 minutes since arrival. We've been trying to stabilize him for surgery, but without someone who can do the repair. He doesn't have another 43 minutes. Imara pointed to a dark spot on the scan. His aorta is going to fully rupture within the hour. Once that happens, nothing we do will matter. "Dr. Okonkwo," a sharp voice cut through the trauma bay. Vernon Marsh stood in the doorway, his expensive suit out of place among the blood and chaos.
She looked down at the boy on the table. 17 years old, maybe 18. Sandy brown hair matted with blood. His father's son in the jawline. But there was something softer in his features too. A gentleness that the father had lost or never had. On his wrist, a faded friendship bracelet. On his neck, a small cross on a silver chain. In his wallet, they had found a photo of him with his arm around an elderly black woman, his grandmother maybe, or a neighbor, someone he loved who looked nothing like him, someone's child, dying slowly while adults argued about protocols, a boy who might have been different from his father, who might have been better, who would never get the chance to prove it if she didn't act now. If you're wondering what she's gonna do right now, drop a comment below. Would you save him? Because what happens next will test everything you believe about justice and mercy. Imara closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. In that darkness, she heard her grandfather's voice. "We heal everyone, baby girl. The moment we choose who deserves to live, we stop being doctors. We become judges, and judges don't have the hands for surgery." She opened her eyes. "Prep OR3, she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I need my team assembled in 4 minutes. Dr. Merritt, you're scrubbing in with me. Bettina, I need you coordinating the nursing staff. And somebody get this man," she jerked her head toward Vernon, "out of my trauma bay." The room exploded into motion. Vernon grabbed her arm as she turned toward the scrub room. "Dr. Okonkwo, do you have any idea what you're doing?" Imara looked at his hand on her arm until he removed it. "Yes, Vernon, I know exactly who his father is. His father put his hands on me 3 hours ago, shoved me into a wall, called me ghetto, told me to learn my place." She watched the color drain from Vernon's face. "Now I'm going to save his son's life, because that's what surgeons do." The doors to the emergency room crashed open. Garrett Slade stormed in like a hurricane, his security uniform still pressed, but his face a mask of pure terror. "Where's my son?" His voice echoed off the walls. "Where's Cody?" He pushed past a nurse, nearly knocking her down. Staff members who had witnessed his earlier confrontation with Imara exchanged glances, but said nothing. "Sir, you need to—" A young resident tried to intercept him. "Don't tell me what I need." Garrett shoved past him toward Trauma Bay 3. "That's my boy in there, my only son." He stopped dead. Through the glass window, he could see his son's pale form on the trauma table, could see the tubes and wires, and standing in the center of it all, reviewing scans with focused intensity, was the woman he had shoved into a wall 3 hours ago. Imara felt his presence before she saw him. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge him, simply continued her review of Cody's imaging. Vernon Marsh materialized at Garrett's side, whispering urgently. She couldn't hear the words, but she could imagine them, explaining who she was, what she could do, why Garrett's son was now entirely dependent on the mercy of a woman his father had brutalized. She turned then, meeting Garrett's eyes through the glass. He looked smaller somehow, deflated. The brutal confidence that had powered his aggression this morning had drained away. "Dr. Okonkwo, that's your name, right? This morning I didn't know who you were." "You didn't know what, Mr. Slade? That I was a doctor? That I was qualified? That I had every right to be in that hallway?" "You didn't know who I was," the words tumbled out desperately.
If you had known I was someone important, you wouldn't have put your hands on me." Imara let that hang in the air. "That's exactly the problem, Mr. Slade. Your son is running out of time. This conversation is over." "Wait." Garrett's hand reached out, then stopped midair as he remembered what that hand had done this morning. "Please, he's all I have. His mother left years ago. It's just been me and Cody since he was 8. He's supposed to start college next fall. Full scholarship for baseball. He doesn't deserve—" "No," Imara's voice softened slightly. "He doesn't. Please." Tears were streaming down Garrett's face now. "I'll do anything. I'll apologize publicly. I'll resign. Whatever you want. Just please save my son." Imara looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had hurt her, humiliated her, treated her like less than human, at this father who was watching his entire world die on a trauma table.
"Mr. Slade, I am going to operate on your son because that is what I do. I am a surgeon. I have taken oaths that matter more to me than any personal grievance. Your son will receive the same care I would give any patient, because that is who I am." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "But when your son wakes up, and I will do everything in my power to make sure he does, you should think very carefully about what kind of man you want him to see when he opens his eyes." She turned to Dr. Merritt. "Let's move. We're out of time." The gurney was wheeled through the corridors with practiced urgency, Imara walking alongside it, never taking her eyes off Cody's monitor. Staff members pressed against walls to make room, some recognizing her now, whispering to each other. The security cameras recorded everything. This woman who had been assaulted hours ago, now racing to save her attacker's child. In the scrub room, Imara stood at the sink, methodically cleaning her hands while her mind ran through the procedure ahead. Beside her, Dr. Merritt worked in silence. They'd only sound the rushing of water and the distant beeping of monitors from the OR. The operating room was cold and bright. Imara stood at the scrub sink, methodically cleaning her hands while her mind ran through the procedure ahead. The Okonkwo technique, named after her, developed through years of research and dozens of successful surgeries in Geneva. Dr. Merritt scrubbed in beside her. "I've studied your papers, Dr. Okonkwo. The dual approach methodology. It's brilliant." "It's necessary," Imara said, drying her hands carefully. "When you have patients who can't survive sequential repairs, you find ways to do both at once. Have you ever lost one using this technique?" Imara paused at the OR door. "I've lost patients, Dr. Merritt. Every surgeon has. But not because I didn't try, not because I chose wrong. We lose them despite our best efforts, not because of them. That's the weight we carry." She thought about the ones she had lost. There had been 17 over her career. 17 patients who had died despite everything she could do. She remembered every single one. Their names, their faces, the moment when the monitor went flat and she knew that no amount of skill or will could bring them back. Those losses had nearly broken her, especially early in her career. She had questioned everything, her training, her judgment, her choice to become a surgeon in the first place. But her grandfather had helped her understand that death was not always defeat. Sometimes, death was simply death, the inevitable end that came for everyone, regardless of how skilled their doctors were. "You don't fight death, baby girl," he had told her after her first patient died on the table. "You fight for life. You fight for every second, every heartbeat, every breath. And when the fight is over, you accept the outcome with dignity and learn whatever lessons it has to teach you." Those 17 deaths had taught her everything she knew about humility, about limits, about the difference between doing your best and being enough. Today, she intended to be enough. They entered the operating room where Cody Slade lay prepped and draped. Monitors beeped in steady rhythm. "Good afternoon, everyone." Her voice was calm as she approached the table. "We have a traumatic aortic dissection and a grade 4 splenic laceration. Standard protocol would say we address the aorta first, but by the time we finish, he'll have bled out from the spleen. So we're not doing standard protocol." She outlined the approach:
2 surgical teams, 2 incisions, synchronized repair. It required perfect coordination, split-second timing, and a level of skill most surgeons spent decades developing. Scalpel. The blade caught the light as it was placed in her hand. Imara took one breath, centered herself, and made the first incision. Blood welled immediately, dark and urgent. The damage was even worse than the scans had shown. Suction. More light on the thoracic field. Dr. Merritt, I need you watching the splenic bleed. The moment I start the aortic repair, you clamp. Not a second before, not a second after. Timing is everything. The team moved in perfect synchronization, a ballet of gloved hands and sterile instruments. Minutes passed in focused silence, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor and Imara's quiet commands. 20 minutes into the surgery, Cody's blood pressure began to drop. He's losing volume faster than we can replace it, the anesthesiologist warned. BP is 80/50 and falling. Push another unit, keep him stable. Imara's hands never stopped moving. We're almost to the tear. 30 minutes. The aortic repair was halfway complete, a delicate reconstruction of tissue that most surgeons would never attempt. Imara's fingers worked with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, but her mind was fully present, fully engaged, anticipating every complication before it arose. Dr. Okonkwo, Dr. Merritt said quietly. His oxygen saturation is dropping. 92%. 90. Increase the O2 mix. We're not stopping now. 40 minutes into the surgery, Cody's heart stopped. The flatline tone cut through the operating room like a scream. For one endless second, everyone froze. Paddles. Imara's voice didn't waver. Charge to 200. Clear. Cody's body convulsed on the table. The monitor stayed flat. Again, 300. Clear. Nothing. In the observation gallery above, Garrett Slade had pressed himself against the glass, watching his son die. Internal cardiac massage. Imara's hands plunged into the open chest cavity. She found his heart and began to squeeze. Steady, rhythmic, forcing the blood to move when it had forgotten how. The body wants to live, she murmured, her grandfather's words flowing through her like a prayer. Help it remember how. Come on, Cody. Come on. 1 minute. 2 minutes. The team watched, breath held, as their chief massaged a dead boy's heart with her bare hands. At 2 minutes and 37 seconds, the monitor blipped. Then blipped again. Then settled into a rhythm.
We have sinus rhythm. Dr. Merritt's voice trembled with relief. He's back. He was never gone. Imara withdrew her hands carefully. He was just deciding. Now let's finish what we started before he changes his mind. The surgery continued for another 3 hours. Imara repaired the aortic tear with a precision that Dr. Merritt would later describe as watching someone paint with scalpels. She saved the spleen that any other surgeon would have removed. She closed incisions that should have been fatal with hands that never trembled once. Throughout the procedure, she felt her grandfather's presence beside her. Not literally, of course, she was too rational for that. But his teachings, his techniques, his philosophy, all of it flowed through her hands as she worked. Every stitch was a tribute to him. Every successful repair was proof that his legacy lived on. She thought about the irony of it all. This morning, this boy's father had tried to deny her access to the surgical wing, had called her ghetto, had told her she didn't belong. And now she was the only person on earth who could save his son's life. The universe had a dark sense of humor sometimes. But she didn't operate with revenge in her heart. She operated with purpose, with skill, with the absolute commitment to excellence that her grandfather had demanded from the first day she picked up a scalpel. Garrett Slade's hatred was his problem. Saving Cody's life was hers. When the last suture was tied, Imara stepped back from the table. Her surgical gown was stained with Cody Slade's blood. Her legs ached from standing. But the monitor showed strong, steady vitals, and that was all that mattered. Outstanding work, Dr. Okonkwo. Dr. Merritt stripped off his gloves. I've never seen anything like that. Imara nodded, allowing herself one small moment of satisfaction. Get him to the ICU. I want hourly updates on his condition, and someone should probably tell his father that his son is going to live. You're not going to tell him yourself?
Imara looked toward the observation gallery, where Garrett's face was still pressed against the glass. "I think Mr. Slade and I will have plenty to discuss later. Right now, let him have his relief. The other conversations can wait." If this story is hitting you right now, drop a like and make sure you're subscribed, because the justice that's coming is something you're absolutely going to want to see. The surgical waiting room had never felt so small. Garrett Slade sat hunched in a plastic chair, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. Word had spread through the hospital like wildfire. The security chief who had assaulted a woman that morning was now waiting to hear if that same woman had saved his son's life. 4 hours and 23 minutes. That's how long the surgery had taken. 4 hours of Garrett replaying every moment of that morning confrontation. The words he'd used, the force he'd applied, the look on her face when he'd shoved her into the wall. He had called her ghetto, had told her she learned her place, had put his hands on her because she dared to walk down a hallway in her own hospital. And then, hours later, she had put those same hands inside his son's chest and restarted his heart. The doors swung open. Imara walked through them, still wearing her surgical cap, fatigue evident in the set of her shoulders. Every eye in the room turned to her. Garrett rose slowly to his feet, his legs unsteady. "Mr. Slade," Imara's voice was professional, measured. "Your son is out of surgery. He's stable." A sound escaped Garrett's throat, something between a sob and a laugh. "He's alive?" "He's alive. The next 48 hours are critical. There's still risk of complications, but his vitals are strong and he's young. He's fighting." Garrett's knees buckled. He caught himself on the chair, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you. God, thank you. I don't know how to—" "You don't have to thank me." Imara's voice carried no warmth, no cruelty either. "I did my job. That's all." "But after what I did to you, you could have let him die. Nobody would have blamed you." Imara was silent for a moment. "Mr. Slade, your boy is innocent. He didn't choose his father. He didn't ask to be in that car accident. He's a 17-year-old boy with his whole life ahead of him. Whatever happened between us this morning, that boy deserved a chance to live it." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "When he wakes up, think about what you want to tell him. About today, about who you are, about who you want to become, because he's going to have questions, and the answers you give him will matter more than any apology you could give me." The doors swung shut behind her. Garrett stood there for a long time, staring at the closed doors, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Around him, the waiting room returned to its normal rhythm. Families
waiting, children fidgeting, the soft murmur of conversations and the occasional page over the intercom. But for Garrett, the world had changed. In the span of a single day, everything he thought he knew about himself had been stripped away, examined, and found wanting. He had always prided himself on being a good man, a good father, a protector of order. Now he saw himself through different eyes, through the eyes of the woman he had assaulted, through the eyes of the staff who had watched him do it, through the eyes of his son who would eventually learn the truth. What kind of man did he want Cody to see when he woke up? That was the question she had asked, and for the first time in his life, Garrett didn't have an easy answer. That night, Imara sat alone in her grandfather's old office. She had found his chair buried under boxes of old files. She sat in it now, looking at his portrait that she had retrieved from his exile by the restrooms. "I saved him, Grandpa. I saved the son of the man who put his hands on me. Was that right? Was that what you would have done?" The portrait didn't answer, but she could hear his voice anyway. "You already know the answer, baby girl. You wouldn't be asking if you didn't." She pulled out her phone and made a series of calls. Her lawyer, her allies on the hospital board, a journalist she trusted, the FBI contact who had been building a case against corruption. By dawn, everything was in motion. The auditorium filled quickly the next morning. Every staff member who could be spared had been summoned to what the announcement called a mandatory all-hands meeting. Imara stood at the podium, dressed in a crisp white coat over a tailored black dress. The white coat had been her grandfather's once, his name still stitched above the pocket. "Good morning," her voice carried without amplification. "For those who don't know me, I am Dr. Imara Okonkwo. My grandfather, Dr. Solomon Okonkwo, founded this hospital in 1962. He built it with his own hands, his own money, and his own vision, a place where anyone could receive quality medical care with dignity, regardless of the color of their skin. She paused, letting the weight of that history settle over the room. Yesterday morning, I was physically assaulted in the hallway of my grandfather's hospital. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I was shoved into a wall and told to learn my place by a man who assumed I was housekeeping staff, not because of anything I said or did, but because of what I looked like. The large screen behind her flickered to life. Security footage played in crisp detail. Garrett's aggressive stance, his words clearly audible, the violent shove that sent her into the wall. But this is not about one man, Imara continued as the footage looped. This is about a culture that allowed this to happen, a culture that has been allowed to fester in this institution for years while I was away. She clicked to a new slide. Complaint records, HR files, financial documents. 17 formal complaints against one security officer, all dismissed. Systematic pay disparities between white and black staff. Diversity programs canceled. Training budgets redirected to personal accounts. Her voice hardened. And over $2 million in hospital funds embezzled through fraudulent contracts orchestrated by our deputy administrator, Vernon Marsh. Gasps echoed through the auditorium. Vernon, seated near the back, shot to his feet and bolted for the exit. 2 men in dark suits were waiting at the door. "Mr. Marsh," one of them said, badge flashing, "FBI, you're going to need to come with us." Vernon's protests echoed through the auditorium as they escorted him out, claiming innocence, demanding lawyers, threatening lawsuits. But the evidence was overwhelming, and everyone in the room knew it. $2 million didn't disappear by accident. 17 complaints didn't get buried by coincidence. This was systematic corruption, and the system was finally being held accountable. Some staff members watched with satisfaction, finally seeing justice for years of witnessed wrongdoing. Others looked away, perhaps wondering if their own silence made them complicit. A few looked genuinely shocked, having somehow convinced themselves that their workplace was exactly what it claimed to be. Imara felt no triumph, only exhaustion, and the grim satisfaction of a necessary task completed. This wasn't celebration, it was surgery, cutting out the infected tissue to save the healthy body. As for Mr. Garrett Slade, Imara's voice drew attention back to the front. He has been terminated effective immediately. Criminal charges for assault are being filed. A hand shot up near the middle of the auditorium. Dr. Harmon, the same attending who had been berating Kessie J. the day before, stood with barely concealed hostility. "Dr. Okonkwo, with all due respect, isn't this a bit of an overreaction? Garrett has been an exemplary employee for 3 years. One misunderstanding with a woman who wasn't wearing proper identification hardly seems like grounds for criminal charges and public humiliation." The room went very still.
Imara let the silence stretch for 3 long seconds before responding. "Dr. Harmon, did you watch the security footage I just showed? I saw a confrontation that got out of hand. These things happen when security personnel are doing their jobs. You saw a man physically assault a woman because of the color of her skin. You saw him shove her into a wall. You heard him use racial slurs." Imara's voice was calm but carried like a blade. "If that's what you consider doing his job, then I have serious concerns about your judgment in other areas as well." She turned to address the full room. "While we're on the subject, Dr. Harmon, you are hereby suspended pending a full review of your conduct toward residents and junior staff. HR will be in touch with the details." Harmon's face went purple with rage. "You can't do this. I've been here for 15 years. Your patients will be reassigned to physicians who understand that respect is not optional." Imara didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Security, please escort Dr. Harmon from the building." The message was clear. No one was untouchable anymore. She looked out over the crowd of faces, some horrified, some relieved, some carefully blank. "I want to be clear about something. This hospital was built to be different. My grandfather endured death threats and bomb scares to create this space. He performed surgery while protesters surrounded the building, and I will not let his legacy be destroyed by greed and hatred." She announced the changes: new zero-tolerance policies, transparent reporting systems, body cameras for security personnel, community advisory boards. She promoted Kessie Aji to a leadership track position. She named Bettina Rawls as the new head of nursing. She appointed Dr. Merritt as the interim chief of emergency medicine. "This is a new beginning," Imara concluded. "For those of you who share the vision my grandfather had, I welcome your continued service. For those who don't," she let the silence speak, "you know where the exits are." The auditorium erupted into applause, but it wasn't universal. Some staff members sat with arms crossed, faces tight with resentment. Others looked around nervously, calculating which side of history they wanted to be on. A few were already gathering their things, heading for those exits Imara had mentioned. She didn't try to stop them. This hospital didn't need people who had to be convinced that discrimination was wrong. It needed people who understood it in their bones, who would fight for it even when no one was watching, who would treat every patient with dignity, not because they were being observed, but because they couldn't imagine doing otherwise. In the weeks that followed, the transformation was profound. New policies were implemented, training programs were expanded, complaint systems were redesigned to ensure that no grievance could be buried or ignored. Community advisory boards were established, bringing voices from the neighborhoods the hospital served into the decision-making process. Not everyone was happy. Some long-time staff members resigned, claiming they couldn't work in what they called a politically correct environment. Imara let them go without argument. Their departure made room for others who had been passed over for years, talented professionals whose skills had been overlooked because they didn't fit a certain profile. 1 month later, Imara stood in the renovated lobby of Sterling Okonkwo Memorial Hospital. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, catching the newly restored bronze letters of her grandfather's name above the entrance. His portrait hung again in its rightful place, now joined by a detailed plaque telling the full story of his journey. Beside his portrait, a new one had been added: Imara in her surgical scrubs, hands steady, eyes focused. 2 generations of healers, side by side. The lobby bustled with the morning rush, but it felt different now. Staff members of every background moved through the space with purpose and pride, their new gold pins gleaming, each one engraved with the hospital's new motto: dignity in every touch. Bettina Rawls approached, her posture straighter than it had been in years. "Dr. Okonkwo, the rededication ceremony is scheduled for this afternoon. The mayor's office confirmed. So did the governor." "Thank you, Bettina." Imara touched the older woman's arm. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I have in 30 years. Bettina's eyes glistened. "Your grandfather would be so proud." As Bettina moved off, Imara made her way to the rehabilitation wing. She had a stop to make before the ceremony. The physical therapy room was bright and active. In the far corner, a young man was taking careful steps between parallel bars, his face tight with concentration. Cody Slade had lost 20 pounds during his recovery. His baseball scholarship was on hold, but right now, ready meant walking 10 feet without assistance. It meant rebuilding a body that had been broken and rebuilt on an operating table. Imara stood at the window, watching through the glass. She didn't enter, just observed as Cody took another shaky step, then another.
He looked up, and their eyes met through the glass. For a long moment, neither moved. Cody knew who she was now, knew everything. His father had told him the whole story during one of those long ICU nights. Cody released one hand from the parallel bars. Slowly, he raised it in a small wave. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear through the glass, but understood anyway. "Thank you." Then he did something unexpected. He turned to his father, who sat nearby watching with hollow eyes, and said something to him. Garrett's face crumpled. He nodded, wiped his eyes, and stood. Slowly, painfully, he walked to the window where Imara stood. They faced each other through the glass, the man who had assaulted her and the woman who had saved his son.
"I don't expect you to forgive me," Garrett said, his voice barely audible through the barrier. "I wouldn't forgive me either, but my son wanted me to tell you something." He swallowed hard. He said that when he woke up in the ICU, he dreamed he was drowning in darkness, and then he felt hands pulling him back toward the light. Strong hands, gentle hands. Garrett's voice broke. He said he knew those hands belonged to someone good, someone who chose mercy when they didn't have to. Imara said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Your son sounds like a thoughtful young man, Mr. Slade. I hope he gets the chance to become even better." She turned and walked away, leaving the boy to his recovery and whatever future he would build from the second chance she had given him. She had thought about going in, about talking to him directly, but what would she say? The rest was up to him. The rededication ceremony drew hundreds of people. Television cameras captured the moment as Imara unveiled the new wing named for her grandfather, as she announced the scholarship fund for underprivileged students pursuing medical careers. "My grandfather used to say that the operating table is the most honest place in the world," she told the crowd. "On that table, there's no race, no wealth, no status, just a body that wants to live and hands trying to help it. That's what I want this hospital to be, the most honest place in Hartwell City." Applause erupted, but Imara's eyes found one face in the crowd. Garrett Slade stood at the very back, alone, wearing civilian clothes instead of the uniform he had lost. He watched with an expression she couldn't quite read, shame perhaps, and gratitude. Their eyes met across the crowded space. For a long moment, neither looked away. There was so much that could have been said, so many words that could have filled the silence between them. Accusations and apologies, recriminations and reconciliations, the whole complicated mess of what happened and what it meant. But Imara didn't need his apology. She didn't need his gratitude. She didn't need anything from him at all. She had done what she'd done because it was right, not because she expected anything in return. And so she simply looked away, returning her attention to the crowd, to the celebration, to the future that was finally beginning to take shape. She didn't acknowledge him. Whatever reckoning Garrett Slade would face, whatever transformation he might undergo, was his own journey now. She had given him the one thing she owed him, a son's life. Everything else was up to him. But she noticed something as she looked away. Garrett had moved closer to a group of black families who had come for the ceremony. He wasn't speaking to them, not yet, but he wasn't avoiding them either. He was simply standing nearby, watching the celebration of a legacy built by people who looked like the people he had spent his life dismissing. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even the beginning of redemption. But it might have been the beginning of the beginning, the first crack in a wall that had taken decades to build. Or it might have been nothing at all. Time would tell. That wasn't her responsibility anymore. That evening, Imara stood alone in operating room 3, the same room where she had held Cody Slade's heart in her hands and refused to let it stop beating. The room was quiet now, the monitors silent, the surgical lights dimmed. But she could still see it all, the pale form of the boy on the table, the flat line that screamed through the room, the desperate rhythm of her hands as she massaged his heart back to life. She had made a choice in that moment, a choice that many people would have made differently, a choice that some would call weakness and others would call strength. She called it medicine. She called it duty. She called it honoring everything her grandfather had taught her about what it meant to heal. Her phone buzzed with a message from Kessie Ajay. "Just finished my first solo procedure. No complications. Patient is stable. Thank you for believing in me." Imara typed back, "Your skill earned this. I just opened the door. You walked through it. Keep saving lives, Dr. Ajay." At the entrance to the surgical wing, where a month ago she had been shoved into a wall and told to learn her place, a new sign hung, the Imara Okonkwo Surgical Center,
healing hands, boundless heart.
She touched the sign lightly, feeling the raised letters beneath her fingertips. Then she pushed through the doors and walked into the night, her grandfather's legacy secure, her own legacy just beginning. Some might say she should have let the boy die. That would have been justice in a certain cruel sense, an eye for an eye. But Imara Okonkwo was not in the business of justice. She was in the business of healing. And sometimes the greatest healing happens not when we give people what they deserve, but when we give them a chance to become something better than what they were. Garrett Slade would carry the weight of his choices for the rest of his life. His son would carry the scar of surgery and the knowledge that his life had been saved by a woman his father had brutalized. The hospital would carry forward a legacy of dignity restored. There would be lawsuits, of course. Vernon Marsh's attorneys would fight the embezzlement charges. Some of the terminated employees would claim wrongful dismissal. The founding families who had profited from the corruption would push back against the new transparency measures. The road ahead would not be smooth, but Imara had never expected smooth. She had expected difficult. She had expected resistance. She had expected that doing the right thing would require sacrifice and struggle and endless grinding work. Her grandfather had taught her that too. Justice isn't something that happens to you, baby girl, he used to say. It's something you build, one brick at a time, one day at a time, one life at a time. And some days, those bricks feel heavier than others. But you keep building, you keep laying the foundation, you keep believing that the structure will hold. The structure would hold. She would make sure of it. And Imara, she would return tomorrow and the day after that, and every day for as long as her hands remained steady. She would teach new surgeons the techniques her grandfather had taught her. She would hold dying hearts and bring them back to life. She thought about the phone call she had received that morning from the University Hospital in Atlanta. They wanted her to lead their surgical department. It was a prestigious position, a chance to influence medical education across the entire Southeast. 5 years ago, she would have jumped at it. But 5 years ago, she hadn't understood what she was leaving behind. She hadn't understood that legacy wasn't just something you inherited. It was something you had to defend, to nurture, to fight for every single day. Her grandfather had given his life to this hospital. Her father had expanded its reach and reputation. Now it was her turn to carry that torch forward, to make sure that the Okonkwo name continued to stand for something meaningful, something lasting, something that would make a difference for generations to come. She sent a polite decline to Atlanta and walked back into the hospital that bore her family's name. There was work to do. There was always work to do. Patients to see, surgeries to perform, residents to train, systems to improve. The hospital wouldn't transform itself, and the changes she had set in motion required constant attention to take root. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not running from grief, not hiding in prestige, not building a career that looked impressive on paper but felt hollow in practice. She was home. She was healing. She was building something that mattered. The most honest place in the world. That's what her grandfather had called the operating table. And that's what she would make this hospital once more. One patient at a time, one truth at a time, one life at a time. Because in the end, that was all any of us could do. Take the broken pieces we were given and try to make something beautiful out of them. Hold the dying hearts and remind them how to beat. Stand firm against hatred and choose healing instead. That was the Okonkwo legacy. That was what her grandfather had built, and that was what she would protect with every breath she had left to give. This was what it meant to be a healer. Not just fixing bodies, but restoring souls. Not just treating symptoms, but addressing causes. Not just surviving hatred, but transforming it into something better through the undeniable power of compassion. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like to support the channel and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you absolutely cannot miss. On your screen right now are 2 more stories I think you're going to love. Have a blessed day, and I'll see you in the next one.